To make our pizza dough, we'll use active dry yeast, salt, flour. We'll need to warm some water, and we're going to use olive oil. You could use canola or vegetable or corn oil, whatever you have in your house, but the olive oil will add a nice flavor to our pizza crust. And you could use all-purpose flour, but we're going to use bread flour because it'll add a nice texture to our pizza dough. The equipment we need to make our pizza includes a bowl for mixing. We'll need dry measuring cups to measure the flour, liquid measuring cup for the water. We'll need measuring spoons for the salt and the oil and the yeast. We're going to need a whisk, a wooden spoon, rubber scraper, straight edge spatula, and I also have the bench scraper, which will be handy during the kneading process. You can either knead on a clean counter or you can knead on a pastry board. And then, of course, we'll also need a pizza pan or a cookie sheet to bake our pizza on once it's ready. To begin making our pizza dough, we are first going to mix our dry yeast and salt with the flour. So for this recipe, I need 1.5 teaspoons of active dry yeast. There's 1 teaspoon. Put that in my mixing bowl, as well as a half. And then we're also going to put in a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And we need 1 3/4 cup of flour. So remember, most sets do not have a 3/4 cup. So we are going to measure a cup plus a half plus a quarter. And we always want to stir the flour around before we measure it. Flour can pack down just sitting because the particles are so fine. As I mentioned earlier in the video, if you would like to use all-purpose flour, you can. The bread flour is just going to give us a little more texture to our pizza. So there's a half plus 1 plus a quarter. And then I'm going to grab just a little more flour out of here with my 1/4 cup and set that to the side because I may need some flour when I knead the dough. So we're going to take those 3 ingredients and whisk them together. The whisk is great because it adds air. It eliminates any lumps that might be in there, and it mixes thoroughly. So now we only have 2 ingredients left that we need to add, our olive oil and our warm water. And our water needs to be between 105 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit, which means we need to test it with a thermometer. So this is water from the sink, and it was on hot when I got it from the sink. But we need to see what temperature it came out of the sink at. Plus it's been sitting for a couple minutes, so it's probably cooled off a little bit. When you are testing the temperature of the water, make sure that the thermometer does not touch the bottom of the measuring cup or the sides, so that you get the temperature of the water and not the temperature of the measuring cup. So this is only about 90 degrees. So we're going to put it in the microwave for about 15 seconds. So I've microwaved the water, and I'm going to check the temperature again with the thermometer just before I put it in. Remember, the recipe needs it to be 105 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And right now this is about 108. You'd be better off to have it a little too cold than a little too hot. because if it's too cold, the yeast doesn't activate, it doesn't rise very quickly. But if it's too hot, you'll kill the yeast and it won't rise at all. So there's my water. And now I need 1 tablespoon of olive oil. So I'm going to measure over a custard cup until the oil bubbles at the edge of the spoon to make sure it's full. And the custard cup is because sometimes it runs over. Then we're going to add that to our dough. And then we're going to mix our dough until it leaves the sides of the bowl. And then we'll tip it onto a lightly floured surface. So we're going to use a wooden spoon for that task. We're just going to mix it all together. Until it mostly comes together. You can see there's kind of big clumps. All the dry flour is getting absorbed into the dough. It's come away from the sides of the bowl and it's kind of becoming a ball on this wooden spoon, which is perfect. Okay, so now we're going to take that and we are going to lightly flour our counter. Notice that the flour is fairly see-through. If I had a lot of pizza dough clinging to the sides of the bowl, I would use the rubber scraper to get it out of the bowl and onto the counter or the pastry board. And now we are going to knead. Knead is a 3-step process. So knead, we push, we fold, we turn 90 degrees. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold. As long as you're doing all 3 steps before you repeat the process, it can be any order. And we need to do this for about 10 minutes to develop the right amount of structure. So I'm going to set a timer. Because it will seem like the longest 10 minutes of your life. So we want to make sure we kneaded enough. If we come up short on kneading, we won't develop enough structure for the dough to trap the carbon dioxide that will be produced during the fermentation process. So what happens in a yeast bread is the yeast feeds on the carbohydrates, so in this case the flour, and produces carbon dioxide and alcohols. The carbon dioxide gets trapped, and that's what causes the dough to expand. And we want it to expand until it's doubled in size. That process is called proofing. Normally in class, we put our dough in a greased or an oiled Ziploc baggie, and we leave it in the refrigerator overnight for a cool rise. But if you're doing this at home, you could put it in an oiled bowl for just an hour. In a commercial kitchen, the yeast dough would go into a box called a proofer that would keep it warm and help it proof or rise more quickly so that it could get more done in a day. But just about an hour in an oil bowl or that baggie is enough in a warm place in your kitchen. So we're going to knead this for about 10 minutes. I am only adding flour if the dough feels sticky. I can knead it without adding any flour. And even when I do add flour, I'm going to add as little as possible. The dough will take in any amount of flour I put down, but it will not develop a nice structure or nice texture if I over flour the dough, if I put too much in. So I have to be very careful about how much I add at a time. So as long as it doesn't feel like it's sticking to my hands or the counter, I just knead without flour. So again, we're going to do this until we get to the 10-minute mark, and then we'll go to the next step. Now we've reached the end of that 10 minutes. It's important to note that there's a difference between sticky and tacky. When you're kneading, if it feels like it should stick to your hand, but it doesn't, that's what I call tacky. So you should not be adding flour at that point. It's if the dough actually comes off and is on your hands or stays on the counter or the board, that's when you're going to add just a light dusting of flour at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare a Ziploc bag with a little bit of cooking spray. And I want to get that everywhere in the bag. And I don't want to have a river of cooking spray. So I'm just going to mush all the corners of the bag into that center area where I sprayed, so that I have it everywhere, so that the dough won't stick to the bag. And you can see I got a nice smooth looking dough by the end of that 10 minutes. So I'm going to put that down in one corner of the bag, zip my bag about halfway shut, and then I'm going to squeeze out every bit of air that I can. Because as this proofs, as this rises, remember it's going to produce that carbon dioxide, that's going to get trapped in the bag. But we don't want it to pop the bag, especially if you're doing a cool rise overnight in the refrigerator. You can't see what's going on, so you can't fix it. Again, if you're just doing this at home, it needs about an hour on the counter in an oiled bowl. 2 is a little better, but you can get by with 1. Basically, you're watching for it to be doubled in size. That's the key when it's proofed enough. So we're going to set this aside for an hour to 2 hours until it doubles in size. if you're fortunate enough to have a stand mixer at home, making a yeast bread like a pizza dough can be a lot more simple. So let's see how that's done in the stand mixer. now that our dough is just about ready, we're gonna go ahead and get our pizza pan ready to go. So I'm gonna brush some olive oil generously around the pan. Just using a pastry brush. If you don't have a pastry brush, you could use a paper towel. Dip it in the olive oil and then wipe it on the pan. That works really well as a substitution. So I just want to coat this. We don't want it to run off of the pan, but we want to be able to very easily tell that the entire surface is coated. So this is going to help our pizza not stick to the pan, and it's also going to add just a little more flavor because it's olive oil. Here you see our dough that we mixed and kneaded by hand, and it has definitely doubled in size. Take it out of the bag. And we'll knead it just a couple of times and see how it feels. It's a little bit tacky, but it's not really sticking, so I'm going to try to work with it. Shape it into a flat disc. See if it'll let me press it out into a circle. You could kind of toss it a little with your hands or work around a circle this way, kind of get it to stretch some more. We're going to try to keep it round because that's the shape of our pan. And once we get it to the point where we feel like it's pretty close to the sides of the pan, or it's just not going anywhere, then we can go ahead and move it to the pan and finish stretching it on there. Kind of try to push the areas with lots of dough towards the areas with not as much dough to make sure that I don't get any rips. And if it's just not cooperating, just not stretching out to where we want it, we can always let it sit for a few minutes and rest and then come back to it. And then usually it's a lot easier to work with. And you might even have to do that a couple of times. Once you get this stretched out to stay the shape of the pan, you'll be ready to go on to the next step. So I have an oven preheating at 400 degrees. Remember, I added as little flour as possible, and this one really didn't need any. So sometimes that's as little as possible. Still shrinking back just a little. It's not too bad. But I think I'm going to let that rest for a minute, and then I'll come back and work with it again. So like I said, my oven is preheating to 400 degrees. I'm going to, after I get this stretched out, I'm going to roll it with a pizza docker to vent the crust. It just helps prevent it from bubbling up really large. If you don't have a pizza docker, it's pretty easy. You can just use a fork, poke holes all over your dough for the same reason. So we're going to bake the crust plain for about 10 minutes. But when this goes in the oven, you have to have everything ready to put on top before you put it in. So that at the end of 10 minutes, you can load it up with toppings and pop it right back in there for another 10 to 15 minutes. Or until you lift up underneath and see that the crust has started to brown there as well. And your cheese should be bubbly. So we're going to do 10 minutes in the oven. Just crust. And then pull it out of the oven and quickly add sauce, cheese, and any other toppings we want. And then bake it for another 10 to 15 minutes. So I'll give this another minute to rest, and then I'll work on getting it closer to the edges, and we'll use the pizza docker, and I'll show you what I mean. Once your pizza is stretched out to the edge of the pan, then we're going to take the docker and we're going to roll across it a couple of directions. What this does is it ventilates the pizza dough so that it doesn't bubble up while it bakes. So now we're going to put this in a 400-degree oven for 10 minutes. And when that 10 minutes is up, we'll add our toppings and bake it for 10 to 15 minutes more until the bottom is golden brown. Here's our delicious pizza, fresh from the oven. You can see the nice brown bubbles on top of the cheese that let us know that it's going to be absolutely delicious to eat.